A quick housekeeping note before we start the show. What you're about to hear is a new series on Cream City Social called State Reppin. You'll hear more about it in a second and why we're doing it, but at the end of each show, I ask Darrin and Ryan, your two state representatives, questions submitted by you. And we're calling it community questions. And we're asking everything from what bills do you support to what's your favorite drink. We're having a little hiccups working out our Facebook page, so in the meantime, please pass your questions on to us through social media. Good old DMing. Or email us at creamcitysocial@gmail.com. That'll be in the show notes below. And with that housekeeping out of the way, here's the music. Welcome back to State Reppin', everybody. And maybe I won't say welcome back this time, but just a regular welcome to State Reppin', the monthly radio show where we get to hear about what's going on in our state capital straight from the source, straight from our state representatives that we elected to represent us. The show is meant to be informative, help everybody get on the same page about what's happening at the Capitol. And if I'm being honest, and I'm making eye contact with Ryan and Darrin right now, this show is to help hold our elected representatives accountable. Make sure they're doing what they said they're going to do and truly representing us. A little bit of housekeeping before we get started. This used to be Jonathan Brostoff and David Bowen's weekly radio show when they were state representatives, and they also talked about what was happening at the state capitol, but on a weekly basis. We'll be taking over the identity of State Reppin', the Facebook page mainly, and with a little bit of luck, maybe this radio show will be a weekly show too. I'm looking at Ryan and Darrin again. And just for a little bit of context, so you know who you're hearing from, I'm Will, the co-host of a podcast called Cream City Social that's out there in the ether. This show will be in episode form on our podcast, so if you ever miss a show, you can go back and listen to it, no problem. That again was Cream City Social, found wherever you can get podcasts. Apple, Spotify, if you're crazy, Stitcher. I'm a graduate student at UWM, work and volunteer at the library, and I'm a lover of all things books. So if you got any reading suggestions, please hit me up in the comments. I'm on a big George Orwell kick right now. And just to put our cards on the table, this show will often be, as I envision it, a conversation with two humans, two regular people working at a job that we've all seen on TV. I want to know what it's like when the cameras are off and the reporters aren't there and there's no more performing. So that's what this is going to be, an honest conversation between four people. And who was the fourth, you might ask? That is you, the listener. And like all great conversations, everyone who is in it has to be participating. So we're going to reserve the last 15 minutes of each show for community questions. We'll ask your questions to your state representatives. We'll be gathering those from our Facebook page, where each week we'll ask what questions you have. So check out the show notes to get your questions answered by your state representatives. All right, finally, the reason that we're all here. Darrin and Ryan, what's going on? How's life?
Life is like a box of chocolates. But life is going well. It's been an interesting close to a month now. Yeah. And we've hit the ground running and not running for office, but now serving in office. And there's a lot of things that have been coming at us, and a lot of things that we've been coming for. So let's continue to talk about it, push forward, and get some things done.
Yeah. I did not realize how much would be coming at us as quickly as it has, but I'm super grateful to be serving with Rep Madison here, with Darrin, because I didn't have that when I was first elected at the county, and it is so good to go in with somebody that I share so much with, and physically sharing an office with in this case, and our staff to some capacity. And it's great. It's intense, but I wouldn't trade it for anything.
No, I appreciate that. What's been coming at you guys?
I mean, when I was elected to the county, we kind of eased into it, right? So and when something is before you at the county level, you have the time to do kind of a deep dive on that thing. Like, you can become an expert on just about everything that comes in front of you, because there's a handful of things that come forward every month. That is not the case at the state. I mean, we have stacks and stacks of potential legislation that we have to rely on our staff and each other to look at first.
And we also have stacks and stacks of one singular budget analysis of the state's huge budget. And, our governor gave a budget address last week.
State of the Union, right?
State of the state.
State of the state.
State of the Union's a little bit higher up in the margins.
It's one more pay grade.
Right. But State of the State, and it was both of our first on the floor, and it was a great experience. And there were some interesting things that were being talked about. Some that we like, some things that we love, some things that we didn't.
Yeah. No, I just got to say, I want the opportunity at some point, whenever I say something, to have like a full marching band come out and play after that. I think that should be the standard for any time anybody says anything.
Indeed.
I did not realize that was going to happen. We were just in our seats. Governor gave his address, and then boom, there was a marching band. I was like, okay, this is a thing.
Oh, was that really?
And it wasn't just one song. It was several songs, and it was festive and it was fascinating. But the juxtaposition between the reaction of many people in the room and the Republicans who sat there stony faced for literally everything that was said, like about veterans, about mental health, they simply did not clap for anything because they didn't want to give anybody a win accidentally. It was weird. And then boom, marching band.
That is weird. So was it kind of silent?
The sound of a marching band.
I do now. They were right next to me, and they were very good, but I didn't expect it.
What did you guys take away from his speech? Was this more or less a what I'm going to do in the next 2 or 4 years?
This was, I think, signaling things about the budget that could be. And I think my response to it was, there's a lot in here that could be really good. And I hope that my expectations for like education funding, for example, are going to be met with what the budget looks like. And I'm afraid that they might not be. But my statement was like, very optimistic. It's like,
it sounded optimistic.
I'm gonna compliment all the things that I wanted to hear and that I want to see in the budget and hope those come true.
Yeah, I mean, in a similar sense, the governor highlighted that this was going to be a budget focused on mental health, and I believe he proclaimed it being the year of mental health. So I'd love to see some bold investments there, especially as we, we're navigating a different stage in the pandemic, right? And the repercussions of it has been taxing on the mental health of so many Wisconsinites and folks all over the country. So maybe a lot of that stays in, maybe it doesn't. It's the process. The budget process is its own beast, and we'll be in it until June. And hopefully the voices of Wisconsinites and the needs of people end up shining through, as opposed to the interests of any of the elected officials that are in this space.
Yeah, and on the one hand, you don't want to get too excited about anything that is in the budget or might be in the budget, knowing that the Republicans are likely to just strip it out. But on the other hand, it's important for us as electeds to advocate for a better future and a really good vision of what could be if there weren't these obstacles in the way. So I think gravitating towards that latter strategy and saying, if we got consensus on these things, if people were as motivated as they could be about them, things could look very different. There is a better way out there.
And what do you got? Yeah. I like that. More optimistic, or at the point in time that we are in right now, you got to take the good stuff, maybe not just what the bad is going to happen. How are you guys going to be involved in the budget process? I don't want to call you guys rookie legislators.
Oh, definitely rookies. But I value that position, right? You can go into a room and you can assume good intentions about the people in there, even if you know damn well that they don't have them, right? And you can ask those questions, and you can put out there a vision of what should be. And what the process has looked like up to this point is that Darrin and I both advocated for items to be put in the governor's budget. The governor is historically and currently very tight-lipped. So every time I see the governor, I'm like, write to council. And he knows now. And when we sat down a few days ago, his staff asked really good questions about what it might look to implement that. And I take that as a really good sign, right? And I am hoping that that's in the budget, because it's easier in some ways to defend something that's already in there than to put out standalone legislation. But either way, that's something that I'm going to be advocating for.
Yeah. Do you have any special interests in here, Darrin, or anything you'd like to see put in here for mental health?
Yeah, I mean, there was a spectrum of things that I highlighted in my statement that I would love to see the governor, and he also talked about a few of them, from mental health to also investments in apprenticeships and career pathways, especially as like I've made a personal commitment to my first term being dedicated to ensure we're creating support systems for opportunity youth. Again, young people ages 16 to 24 that are out of school and out of work. Some who have been, who are navigating the foster care system, some who are navigating the justice system, some who are struggling in our educational systems, right? And have been forced into alternative schools and so on, right? In my head, that's those folks are left behind populists that need a bold advocate, and I'm hoping to champion pieces of the budget that align with that, right? So we have the opportunity over the next 6 months while we're navigating our committees to uplift those issues, to leverage our platforms as a way to inspire folks to also ask to affirm those values and so on, and hopefully that shines through not only through the governor but the Joint Finance Committee, and then also helps build folks' capacity outside the space to show up at budget hearings and testify and talk about these issues, and really ensure that they actually happen.
And that feels like that goes back to Ryan's thing, where every time he sees Governor Evers, write to council, write to council, write to council. Let them know that this is what you care about. Can I ask kind of a strange question of like, how do you get people comfortable enough to go testify in person or write letters? To me, that does seem a little bit intimidating growing up apolitical.
Yeah, I mean, the first couple times I testified, way prior to being elected, I was terrified. And I think, like my child, or my children, I think Sebastian in particular, grew up and that was the norm. I think they were 8 years old when they testified in front of the Milwaukee County for the first time. It was about making essentially Milwaukee County a sanctuary county for immigrants and folks. And they were really, just terrified. The whole process, you could see them getting like more and more scared. They filled out the comment card. They were waiting and waiting. And then it was time for them to be called. And I gave them an out. I said, you are clearly, you're clearly very scared. Like, I get this. We can go home, right? And they said, no, this is the right thing to do, and got up there and testified. I think it was a total of 2 or 3 sentences, but it was heartfelt. Everybody clapped. And I was so proud of them for doing that. And they've, testified on things since then. But not everybody grows up with that. And even now, like when I testified in front of committee after being elected, they made me wait and wait. They put everybody, before me in a very intentional way, because all the committees are Republican led. But it's still nerve-wracking getting up there. But it's less nerve-wracking when you know what you're talking about, when you're speaking from experience. And what I spoke about was actually the cash bail entrenchment questions that'll be on our ballots in April. I spoke against those, and I thought that I was going to be speaking for 2-3 minutes, and they kept me up there for I think 33 minutes with a lot of questions, and it was a good chance to really explore that policy and why this would be a terrible thing to do more in depth. And I'm really grateful that the Republicans gave me that chance, gave me many chances to talk about why it was bad, and to lay bare the fact that their own policy is not based in data, that it's really based in this, idea of vengeance, or this, this popular law and order idea, which is really detrimental to the way we're running things. But no, I think a lot of it is just working with people and saying, you don't need to be the expert. All we're asking you to do is get up there and speak to your experience. Tell us what you have, what has brought you here. Why are you testifying? What brought you here? And then ideally, if you can bring some data to bear on that too, that's a bonus. But it's terrifying and also really necessary. We need folks willing to do that.
Yeah. There's a universal acknowledgement that it's hard to get up in front of folks who, from the outside perspective, you believe are the experts on the subject, and they expect you to have, so much data to support your facts and so on. But the reality is that none of us are experts in everything, right? On all the committees that I sit on, that Ryan sits on, that any legislator sits on, they're not the expert on every aspect of that, because it's improbable, and it's impossible to have a complete holistic scope of lived experience as it relates to that body of work, that specific legislation, and so on. But when someone comes in and they're speaking to their own lived experience, they are the experts of that, right? And if you remind them that at the end of the day, you're the expert of your own experience, that provides a layer of comfort, and to extent some confidence as it relates to being able to speak in affirmation or speak against a bill or a legislation or resolution.
Yeah. I always think what my therapist says, where you can't be wrong when you're talking about your experience.
Exactly.
Very similar. You guys were just talking about your committees that you're on. Could you let us know which committees you guys did get selected for and did get put on?
The ones I'm most excited about are housing and corrections. And I think those are the ones I'm really going to engage with the most. I'm also on audit and a couple others. What about you?
I am on corrections with Ryan. I'm on criminal justice and public safety. I'm on workforce development.
Oh, nice.
And I am on children's and families. So as like I was talking about initially with Opportunity Youth, there's a clear linear intersection of all those committees, and being able to see the vast perspectives of folks in these committees, and become, to extend someone who understands a deeper need for the challenges that folks face in these spaces is exciting for me.
Very exciting. And then tie all those puzzle pieces together. It always feels like one solution for one thing, and then that causes 6 problems over here. So one holistic view. That seems really right. And I want to go back to what Ryan was talking about, where he got, I don't want to say stuck up there, but a little bit, got to talk for 30 to 40 minutes about the referendum questions. How do these committees work logistics-wise? Is this a big room, and then there's a speaker or a committee chair, and then they motion, and it's very procedural?
Yes.
What does that feel like? What is that like?
Well, it's not always a big room.
Sometimes it's a small room. So this was a popular one because it was a joint committee. So this was both the Senate side and the Assembly side talking about this. It was a joint hearing. So you had a lot of people, each of whom wanted their 5 minutes, and we're happy to try to take swipes at me, and I think it went well. But yeah, I mean, the more that you can harness people's desire to kind of get the spotlight, and then to really turn that back to policy and saying, we're really exploring the issue as much as you possibly can, the better. It's unusual for somebody to show up in a committee where they don't have something in front of that committee and speak to something, or in my case, in opposition to it. And in fact, one of the Republicans, Shea Sortwell, started out by saying, it's really weird that you would show up and speak about policy. I'm like, well, it's not. Like, I'm an expert on this in a couple of ways, not necessarily because I'm a new person in the Assembly, but as somebody in Milwaukee County, we've seen the effects of over-incarceration. This is going to incarcerate a ton of people. We just sent tons of people down to Racine because our own jails are so full. And the Darrell Brooks case that keeps being invoked in order to justify this, and which, by the way, would not have been affected by this, Darrell Brooks likely still would have been out on bail, is important to me because I was the father of a child in that parade who was missed by a matter of inches. And my child, Alex, was not hit by the car, but he was certainly not missed by the trauma of seeing his friends and people around him hurt. I mean, again, that was me speaking in large part to my personal experience as a county supervisor, as a father. And I hope that the the best testimony really comes from that. I mean, people, and I brought a ton of data. I had a stack of stuff in front of me. So when they said that this would mean public safety, I was able to clap back and say, actually not, right? So this report just came out in March saying just the opposite, that when we incarcerate people, we're more likely to incarcerate them in the future. And that when we jail people pre-trial, we're actually making it less likely that they will be found innocent. And that it ultimately doesn't make sense to use money as a proxy for innocence. Because if somebody should be separated from society until their trial, having money does not mean that they're not dangerous. If somebody is not dangerous, not having money, doesn't mean they should be put away. And that's really the crux of that. So.
And maybe, so I really like what you're saying, but when they word this, these were amendments, constitutional amendments that were going to get added on, and then these are going to be questions on the referendum on the April 4th ballot. And so the wording of it is, it changes how judges decide cash bail for people charged with violent crimes. If passed by voters, it would give judges more criteria to consider when imposing bail on detained persons.
On the face of it, that sounds really reasonable.
Right? Doesn't that
giving the judges more tools to look at stuff. So the problem here really is that we're not giving them more tools. The effect of this absolutely will be just to incarcerate more people. We already incarcerate plenty of people. In fact, Wisconsin incarcerates 1 out of 36 of our black residents. That's more than any other state, period. What this will do is essentially tie the hands of judges and force them to consider previous records. We know that the previous records are inequitable. So this is entrenching inequity. It's also entrenching a system of cash bail, which in itself is terrible. And there are better ways out there to do it. So in fact, if you look at New Jersey's model, if you look at the federal model, they do not look at the amount of money that somebody has in their pocket as a proxy for if they're a danger. They look just at the risk. And I think that there are ways that we can improve on New Jersey's system. It's not perfect. Everybody objectively says that it's far better than the system that we have now. So to double down on Wisconsin's cash bail system right now makes no sense. What we should be doing is scrapping it and then going to a system where we just look at if a person is likely to be a danger to their community rather than how much money they have, which seems, when you put it like that, it makes much more sense. The questions on our ballot in April do not look like that. The questions on the ballot in April are muddying the issue, but they both deserve a flat no if you believe that we should not be incarcerating people based primarily on if they have money in their wallet.
Right. And the other constitutional amendment that's going to be on the ballot is going to ask the public's opinion on whether to require childless, able-bodied adults to search for employment while receiving public benefits.
Every part of that question is so bad.
Yeah,
doesn't it sound like Tucker Carlson?
The reason why that one just doesn't make sense is because it's already a law. It's already written into our law. Folks have to do that. So we're to make a referendum and put it on the ballot and say, hey, what do you think? Do you think we should do this? It's purely a political, it's political in nature, right? Folks are trying to get people to turn out for by doing two things. One, creating a narrative that we're not tough enough on crime. And this, by doing this, we will bring the most violent offenders, and ensure that they're incarcerated. Right? We could actually do that if we, eliminated cash bail and actually looked at all of the circumstances and said, hey, you're either not a harm to the community or you are a harm to the community, and left it at that, right? Instead of saying, hey, you could be a harm to, you're a harm to the community.
But you got a little bit of money.
You got money. So let me take that money, right? But that's that. And then on the other end of the spectrum, saying like,
childless,
affirming
able-bodied adults.
Exactly, affirming the fact, affirming the idea that folks just want to take advantage of the system, which is a common belief that folks try and bolster as something that is wrecking our economy. In reality, things are a lot more complex than that. And then two, we already have a system in place that is exactly that, to navigate it. So, this may increase turnout in this upcoming Supreme Court's race. And that's why folks are really pushing this manner. Don't let them get you to believe that this is anything more than that.
And it was amazing to hear Republicans on the floor defending that second one, the childless adults thing. It was nuts. And they were standing up there like giving, examples of small businesses that had been ghosted by employees, right? So an employee makes an appointment to have an interview and then just doesn't show up to it.
Okay.
And they were saying how terrible this was, but then they introduced this legislation which would make people do that more. In theory, like in fact, like people are required to do job searches. And I texted Becky, who's my amazing wife and partner, and who runs our own small family business, and said, are people ghosting us anymore? Because they used to, right? Like back when we paid, like $8.50 an hour plus tips, we would have people, I think, use this as a job search thing. They'd set the appointments and just not show up.
Check off the box.
But I was like, hey, like these days, now that we're paying, like $15 an hour plus, and we have health insurance and we have a union, are people ghosting us? And she's like, no, literally never. Like,
see, that's
so
what I was
as it turns out, when you pay people more, you have better working conditions. They don't ghost. It isn't about people turning down jobs. It's people turning down shitty jobs. Oh, sorry. People turning down
poopy
icky jobs. Right? I forget this is going to be aired.
You want to restate that?
No. I'm going to stand by shitty.
You want to restate that in the proper context?
As it turns out, it's not people turning down jobs. It's people turning down terrible jobs. And for the record, if you are in Milwaukee County, there will be another, I think, a fourth question on your ballot, and that one is about your basic bodily autonomy and if we should repeal the ridiculous and terrible and archaic ban on abortions. And I know because I wrote that one.
I was going to say, whose idea was
Milwaukee
that?
County. Oh, that was mine. Yeah, that was. As it turns out, that will be on the ballot. It almost wasn't. In fact, it was supposed to be on the November ballot. We missed getting it on that ballot by one vote. Thank you, moderates. But those folks were convinced through a long process of grassroots organization from RJAM and other folks to vote for it. In fact, it passed 13-4 on the county board, and that will be on your ballot. And that is, I think, one of perhaps the only good question that'll be on your ballot in April, because it's asking you to change the status quo, not to entrench it, or in the case of the childless, able-bodied adults, to just be a messaging thing that is just reinforcing what is already out there.
True.
To be a political stunt.
And yeah.
I was going to ask you, but then I forgot. But I was going to ask about, the political pressure that caused that referendum's switch of the change of votes from not making it to then being 13-4. What kind of political pressure is that? And sometimes I feel like we hear that write your representatives, make some noise, and then things will change. And I'm not sure in my mind I have that linkage correct, and that actually affects things. Does it?
It does sometimes, right? So, and shout out to Reproductive Justice Action Milwaukee. These folks were amazing. They did not take that no vote lying down. They dragged a lot of the folks in the middle that really should have voted to get it on the ballot in November. They engaged in, physical advocacy. They had marches, they had rallies. I think they showed up at folks' homes. They showed up online, and it was successful. And it was so good to see it work, because it doesn't always, and sometimes that can be frustrating. But I was really inspired by them. Those folks and others like them really keep us honest. And I've met with them a couple times afterwards too. We need to do more. I am thrilled that we got this question on the ballot. We need to do more, and I think organizations like that have a big place in that.
And I think it always ends up coming down to being able to display true power as it relates to the stakeholders you're interacting with, right? A lot of the time, if we pulled mass and got a 1,000 folks to come and testify about why this should be on the referendum, but that 1,000 folks were from Chicago, right? That would mean a lot different for the stakeholders at hand, because those aren't the folks that they represent, right? Versus 1,000 folks that are stakeholders in those districts, right? That means something. I think that commonly where people fall short of thinking about how change is manifested, is not having a true analysis of the power dynamics in decision making, right? At the end of the day, you have a certain amount of folks who vote that person in. If you can influence that stakeholder base, you can influence their decision making. And you'd hope that, you could just have a cordial conversation and they would, just align
See
with
the light of day.
Right? See the light of day. Everybody's not like that, right? Like everybody's not looking at policy from the perspective of folks' lived experiences. Sometimes they're just looking at policy from the perspective of who has the ability to define if they can be reelected or not. And that's a reality in this, this political system, in this landscape we exist in. I mean, the same thing applies to businesses, right? If you can threaten their monetary growth, you can threaten their ability to, if they have a product, if they do a thing, or so on, right? It happens all the time. It's pulling the levers where the levers matter.
Yeah. And that really speaks to where the best legislation should come from, right? So not to get too inside baseball here, but when I tried to get that question on the ballot, prior to November, and it was clear that there were a couple of folks in the middle that were going to vote against it, I went to each of them individually and I said, I'm authoring this, but this is not my policy. This is not my idea. This is not my resolution. I'm authoring this for stakeholder groups. And there is nothing that I'm going to be able to do to hold them back. And in fact, I won't if you vote against this. And they blew me off. And boy, it did not go well for them. And on the floor, when it was clear that they had to vote for it, I said that again. Like, I am so glad that these folks came around because they had to, because stakeholder groups dragged them that way. And I, again, gave them that shout out. But it works. I mean, they saw their political futures threatened. And that is why I think at least several of them finally did the right thing. Whether it was the right thing for the right reasons, the right thing for the wrong reasons, it's still a vote. And I think that's where advocacy is potentially the most valuable.
Do those no votes matter too? Like that voting record, and then people going back and being like, hey, you voted no against abortion.
I mean,
it's important to get people on the record like that.
These things, all of them end up coming back, right? Folks who are really engaged in paying attention to the work, your decision making in that space, they don't forget when it comes back around to election cycles, when it comes down to you asking them for money to help with your campaign, or them supporting something that you want to do, right? And it's it's good to have that kind of transparency and that level of accountability. I love that there are systems to be able to look at what elected officials have voted for and what they haven't. If you want to look at me and Ryan's voting records at the state, you can simply go to the state's website and go to our direct pages, and you can see our entire vote history up until this point, and see if you like something or see if you didn't like anything, and actively say, hey,
what the heck?
Why didn't you support this, or why were you against it? I want to be to be able to communicate with folks about why I did and why I didn't support something actively, right? Because that's what representation looks like. But that can't happen if folks don't reach out.
Right. And that's ultimately what accountability looks like, right? And I'm grateful that folks in the public do have that resource. Everybody has a web page, generated by default that shows all the votes. The problem is that what it doesn't show the ton of really good things that aren't getting a committee hearing, and that therefore nobody is ever voting on, and they aren't making it to the floor because we're so gerrymandered. There's going to be a ton of legislation, that I'm sure Darrin and I will author over the next 2 years that won't even be assigned to a committee.
or a bill number.
Right. Yeah. Won't even see the light of day, so that nobody can weigh in on it. So one of the differences between the county, where everything is referred, right, and the state, where it has to be palatable enough, or you have to find somebody across the aisle, essentially, that's willing to champion it. It really limits the scope of what's out there. So you're going to see lots of brave votes from us against things, but you may not see, unless we have venues like this to talk about what isn't seeing the light of day yet.
What does it take for it to see the light of day? Is that a certain amount of votes that gets it referred to a committee, or is that like the chairs of each of these committees get to?
Yeah, so it's a few things, right? So what happens is a piece of legislation is drafted, and we work. A piece of legislation is drafted, and we work with the different relative bureaus to be able to draft that legislation, compare it to current state statutes, and see if it's palpable to actually be a law in the state of Wisconsin, right? Because there's no way that we can know all of the laws that have been passed over the 170.
173. We should probably know that.
Yeah, we should know that.
We'll fix this in post. But I think it's about 173.
Right. 170 plus years that the state has existed. And we have to make sure that it doesn't conflict with anything else. Once that's passed and we have a piece of legislation drafted, we send it to folks for co-sponsorship, right? Once it's we have co-sponsorship, or co-authorship, depending on the approach, right? It can be sent to committee, but that decision isn't in the hands of just the legislator, right? It's in the hands of...
Yeah, whose hands is it?
It's in the hands of the speaker. The speaker gets to decide if it gets a bill number, and then if it gets a bill number, it goes to committee, and then if it passes in committee, it goes to the floor. And that's where, the broader conversations happen. Initially, actually, the initial conversations happen in committee, right? Because there's a process where we have a period where we look at the piece of legislation, and folks on the committee get the opportunity to talk about amendments and changes. And then there's a moment for public hearing where folks can talk about if they support it or not. And then there's the final vote, right? After it goes through that, it goes to the floor, and on the floor, the entire 99 of us we vote on it, and then once it passes there, it has to pass in the Senate, and then it goes to the governor's desk, right? So that's the process, right? But we have to win at different nexus points of that process to even get it to committee. And that's when we begin to have some conversations about it. But thousands of bills don't even get that far annually.
I was going to ask, how many do you think are not going to get through for you? Because I know Ryan writes a ton in the county level.
Yeah, and my weapon of choice has always been the shotgun and not the sniper rifle, right? And it is, and I've gotten more passed than anybody in recent memory. That is not going to happen at the state level. And yeah, the short answer, as Darrin pointed out, is that it's in the hands of essentially one person. It's Robin Voss, who has open contempt for Milwaukee, who does not play well with others if those others aren't subservient to him. So yeah, I think there's the potential for us to write some legislation, some common sense, pragmatic stuff that will get killed, and some other common sense, pragmatic things that we find somebody on the Republican side who will beg or plead or cajole for it to get a hearing and get passed. The more common, I think the more likely route for some of our things is going to be us doing a ton of legwork and doing the research and making sure that bill is bulletproof, and then handing it over without our name on it to the other side. And then only, jumping in and supporting it after the fact, after it's out there, because politics, right? But ultimately, I don't care whose name is on it if we're passing good legislation, if we're getting the legwork done.
Good things happen. Doesn't matter who gets the credit.
Yeah.
Have you guys identified anybody on the other side, the Republican side, of who may be receptive to some of this common sense legislation?
Yeah. So I know we're both engaged in kind of talking with the chairs of each of our committees, and all the chairs are Republicans, right? And then we have what's called ranking members on the Dem side, who have a little bit of influence, but are still not chairs. And yeah, I think the chair of housing, Chairman Brooks, strikes me as a really reasonable person. I think we've talked about eviction expungement, which would be fantastic. And it was a fascinating conversation, right? So I went in there saying, like, essentially, once you're evicted, and we know this well in Milwaukee, it's really tough to get into safe, supportive housing. So it's important not to get that eviction.
Once you have one or two, it's almost over.
Right. So we were chatting about this in his office, and I said, this would be so great for tenants. And he had a very different perspective as a large a large landlord, was like, well, regardless of what you think about tenants, like, this is really good for landlords, because those mean, terrible tenants will be less mean and terrible to the good, upstanding landlords if, when they have an eviction on their record, they can see the light at the end of the tunnel. Right? They're not going to want another eviction, so they're going to be really good for that 3 years or 5 years or maybe 1 or 2 years. So ultimately, I hope that we can collaborate on legislation like that, even if our perspectives are very different. If the end goal is the same, I'm confident we can get there.
Yeah, that just sounds like sewer socialist, common sense stuff.
Right.
Yeah. Anything else you guys want to talk about? I got a couple more things, and we got community questions at the end.
Yeah.
But anything, I don't know, interactions with new people on the Democratic side you've had that have been interesting, Republican side that have been interesting?
I mean, it's all been, it's been an interesting dynamic, right? Navigating the space, not only as Democrats, but Democratic Socialists. In that space,
only two.
Only two, right? Sometimes that's difficult. Sometimes that is, sometimes that's easier, right? It all just depends on who you're talking to and when you're talking to them. It's circumstance.
Has it ever been a positive?
It has. I mean, we've gotten a lot of traction, a lot of national media, wanting to hear about how we're going to navigate this space, not only as a minority, but a super minority, right? People commonly talk about the super majority. We are the super minority.
That's a t-shirt.
Right? And, that means that we have to be extremely tact about how we approach navigating this work, and, being strategic about how to build coalitions, and widespread coalitions, across political boundaries, to pass legislation.
Is this coalitions with politicians, or is this coalitions with community?
This is with community. At the end of the day, everyone in that space, represents their populations and their districts, but our base and the folks we need to be able to support and pass legislation that we want to pass has to be broadened, way broader than our districts, for the legislation to pass or for it to even see committee, because folks won't want to let anything that we touch show face. But we are effective organizers, and we bring that into this space, and that's how we'll get things done, by deepening our relationships with people, right, and their lived experiences, and authoring legislation that align with their lived experiences, their values, their passion, and then supporting them in being able to show up in the Capitol when necessary, and reach out to folks throughout the state to support legislation. And I think that's where a lot of folks have failed in this work in the past.
No, that's well put. And I think people in the Capitol are still kind of trying to feel this out. I mean, I get the sense that, there's been a lot of attention around us, and I think we've been able to, I wouldn't say capitalize since we're socialists, but we've been able to to exploit that in good ways. But yeah, I think people want to be sure that we're not throwing bombs at them. And I think I'm really encouraged, especially by the our freshman colleagues, how generally accepting they've been, but also still trying to feel things out. Like they know what a Democrat is. They have no idea
you're an unknown
for the most part what a
quantity.
socialist is. But there's also a lot of excitement around that. We've been getting, fan mail. People are, like clipping our newspaper things from stuff across the country, sending that to our offices, and it's really neat to see the excitement and the hope I think this has generated for a lot of folks.
That's super neat. Okay, we got 3 more minutes until community question time.
All right.
Most important time. When you were talking about deepening ties throughout Wisconsin with these organizations, that made me think of shared revenue.
Mm-hmm.
Does that seem to fit with this general appeal, wide tent idea that you guys are going for?
Yeah. I think that most municipalities in this state, in every county, guaranteed, are dealing with issues as it relates to shared revenue. And I think uniformly, across the aisle and in the legislature, everybody knows we need to address this. Yeah. Now, the approach to addressing it is where we differ. And that's what it's going to end up coming down to. Some real conversations about how can we tangibly address shared revenue in the state of Wisconsin. And that's a good way to build some amazing relationships with folks that we never fathomed that we'd meet or would even welcome us in space. So that will be definitely something, especially over this first term, that we'll have to navigate. The governor talked a lot about shared revenue in his State of the State, talking about the importance of the sales tax, which Ryan can speak to his opinions on. There's going to have to be more that we do collectively to build a realistic long-term solution to this issue, because
you could hand out money here and there, but
the system isn't working. So we need to fix the system itself, and we need to have some real conversations as it relates to what that solution is.
And that's one of the things I'm most hopeful but also scared about. So the vast majority of the 24 incoming freshmen to the assembly, so about a quarter of the assembly, have local government experience. So they know what it's like to be at the city or town or county level and being starved of resources. Because this isn't something just unique to Milwaukee, although Milwaukee's being hit by it incredibly hard.
As the biggest city,
the
biggest financial contributor to this state.
And if we do nothing, the city of Milwaukee will be bankrupt in 2 or 3 years. So there needs to be immediate action to increase shared revenue. Part of that talk is about increasing the sales tax. Sales taxes are bad. They're regressive. That said, I think that any local municipality or county should have the ability to tax themselves in whatever way they see fit. But I don't think we should levy a sales tax because it's regressive. It falls much harder on the poor, much harder on the working class. My concern is that leaders in Milwaukee are going to come to a compromise with the state GOP to allow us either some combination of shared revenue and sales tax, but that will tie our hands in terms of how we can spend those dollars. And I think the most likely compromise is going to be, as long as you keep giving a ton of money to the police, we'll give you a little bit more money overall. And that is the absolute worst possibility, because you can tax yourself in this really terrible regressive way to hurt the poor, as long as you keep giving so much of the money generated from the poor and middle class to the police, who then repress the poor and middle class. So not ideal from a socialist perspective, and I think we're going to differ around the very important details here, while agreeing that shared revenue overall should go up.
Yes. Maybe just a little bit of background. I should have said this when we first started. Shared revenue is whenever all of our revenue from Milwaukee, we put it in a pot, send it to Madison, and then they give us money back based on allocations. I'm not sure quite what, but then some of that comes back to Milwaukee, and then that's what we use to operate our city budget, along with other money, but a lot of it's that shared revenue, and that's where we're feeling that financial cliff that everyone keeps talking about.
It's getting our own money back.
Yeah.
Specifically as you think about Milwaukee, a lot of the narrative, at least in the state house, has been, why should we help Milwaukee with their financial crisis, right?
Yeah, exactly.
They mismanage their money, so we have to bail them out, right? That's the narrative, and folks are eating it up because no one knows, especially from around the state, how we use our dollars, right? Whether it's Milwaukee County or the city of Milwaukee, right? But the reality is this, right? We contribute the biggest amount of the state's revenue to the state, right? Out of all municipalities, out of every county, right? That the percentage of that we get back has been subpar, super subpar,
It's
and
less
has
than
been
we give.
substantially less than we give, right? And has been decreasing since 2010 by $10 billion. No, not by 10 billion. My bad. By 10 million. Right? Yep. Let me correct myself. It has been decreasing by 10 million every year, which means that in grand total, right, our deficit up to this point is close to 1.2 billion, right?
City of Milwaukee's
financial deficit is close to $1.2 billion.
I heard the state's sitting on $6.2 billion.
Right. So as you think about like our financial crisis, what do you think would happen to a city when it's been underfunded, by at least 10 million? I say at least because I don't know all of the numbers, but I know for a fact that 10 million has been a net loss every year, right? Since 2010.
Think of the schools that contract. Think of the library hours that get cut.
Right. And as a result, right, like you said, city services go down. Needs consistently rise because as services go away, and resources go away, needs cannot be met. Right. And populations grow every year. Right. Inflation goes up. It's inevitable. Which means that the constraints that we're dealing with now are, all the issues that we deal with.
They just keep getting ratcheted up.
They're now not only Milwaukee's issue, or caused by Milwaukee. They're caused by the state, and the state needs to acknowledge that.
You know what the solution is, though?
Tell me, Ryan.
It's more police.
Wouldn't have expected that one, but I appreciate it. All right, community questions. Most community part of this podcast, radio show, live on River West Radio, 104.1. Put your dials in wherever you are. Molly asks you guys, what's a typical day like for you two? Which pant leg do you put on first?
I jump in with both feet at the same time. It's just airborne. No, it's. I think I'm still trying to find my rhythm there. Like we're trying to figure out, because I'm used to being in my district. I'm used to being here at home so often. And in fact, at the county level, I try not to go into my office at all. I'm there for meetings, but like I want to be in the community. I want to be meeting people, in our coffee shops and restaurants and all that. I don't want to be in the office. This position requires us to be there physically, frequently, much more frequently. And part of that is really good and collaborative and trying to get our feet under us. But it is, it's tough to balance. And also it would be nice to see my family at some point this month. And it's not always possible to do everything. But I think I'm going to continue to err on the side of being in the community and taking as many meetings with as many stakeholders as we can.
Like that. Darrin, what's your day like? You said you don't eat much for breakfast.
Yeah, I'm very bad at eating. I'm not going to lie to you. Though I'm not losing many pounds. I don't know how, but like I definitely
antimatter.
I'm antimatter. But a day is, at the beginning of the day checking in with my staffer who really runs the show. And ensuring that, we are being effective and communicating and beginning to, uncover this thing that is the state legislature and all its happenings. And then also, going into the office whenever I can, and then also spending, a decent amount of time in the district as well, connecting with residents and other stakeholders so that we can begin to explore policies that we can draft that are based in the needs of the folks in the 10th district, and then, strategizing with this guy. Our doors are right next to each other. And, then doing the work in the building. And then also spending time communicating about what's happening there. Because what I was told, but I was one huge piece of advice that I was told by other state legislators, former state legislators, is that
word too. Gets me every time.
Yeah, is that to believe that everyone in your district knows what's happening in the state house is the first fallacy, right? The first fallacious thing you can do. The reality is that they don't know. And it's your job to communicate with them the happenings of Madison and how you're navigating that, and also building and strategizing with them so that you can move collectively. That's what I try and do, right? Every day, that's in the back of my head. How am I learning what's happening in this space? How am I effectively communicating that back? And how am I helping folks build critical mass and class consciousness as it relates to the issues that are happening in this state?
Yeah, and I mean, I've got to say, we are so fortunate to have amazing staff. So shout out to Amelia and then David on
David
Darrin's
O'Keefe,
side, who are just, they're not our assistants. They really are part of a team. So when we sit down and we go over legislation, we have that huge stack of all the things coming in front of us. And we're trying to weigh in and figure out what the traps are and everything else. I mean, it's a conversation with four people, and they are both excellent, and I'm so glad. And so, so grateful for them.
And
they're also both DSA members, which is really nice. So we have really a socialist caucus of four.
And it's also a conversation with more than four people, because we don't try and make the decisions in our bubble of four. We try and reach out to various stakeholders to get a sense of how this affects, again, our districts, pots of work, in the rest of the state. And because a lot of folks believe that like legislators should just know and, expect them to know everything. I'm not going to ever claim to be a master of all.
Can't be,
right? So we are building and increasing a list of stakeholders that we go to as it relates to the issues, whether it's related to healthcare, related to workforce development, corrections, the criminal justice system, agriculture, right, tourism, and so on, so that we can both support the best legislation that can help Wisconsinites, and we can introduce the best legislation that supports Wisconsinites.
And that's the most exciting thing about these initial kind of weeks and months, right? It's being able to say, I have no idea what you're asking me, and I'm going to go find out, and doing those tours. And I think at the county level, some of my best experience was doing, ride-alongs with the parks rangers, ride-along with our homeless outreach teams. And I'm really looking forward to, getting into the MSDF and Lincoln Hills and Copper Lake, and talking not to the administrators, at large length of these, but the folks who were doing the work closest to the people that we're serving, and talking to folks who are incarcerated, talking to folks who are receiving our services and figuring out how to do it better.
Oof, you guys are good answers to questions. That we might have to have more than 15 minutes for community questions.
Yeah,
at the
that'd
end.
be great.
That was good. I'm gonna save my tough questions. My grandma had a couple, and so I'm gonna save those for next time.
All right.
Watch out. Any last words? We're signing off here. Anything you guys want to say before we sign off?
No, thank you so much. I really appreciate this opportunity. There are some big shoes to fill in terms of Brostoff and Bowen and keeping this name. So I hope we can do that some honor.
Indeed. Like always, I'm glad that folks are listening in as it relates to the journey. And, we'll be sharing all of our lessons while we're repping in the state capitol. So stay tuned.
Here on State Reppin. Again, this is on River West Radio 104.1. Tune in wherever you get it. And until next time, take care of each other, and we'll talk to you next time.